By the time I was 6 years old, I was driving a tractor out in the fields. By the time I got to be 9 years old, they started letting me take the tobacco actually from the fields up to the barns. So that means I was driving on the road. And that was back in the very early 60s. Today, something like that would be completely unconscionable to folks, having a 6-year-old, much less 9 years old, driving a tractor on the road. But looking back on it and being reflective, that one incident in itself had a big impact on my life. I would just keep it out in the field in first gear, just steering. And I did that for a couple of years, and they were long days. I don't remember them being anything but hot, and they were hot. And by the time I was 9, I was actually taking the tractor from the fields to the barn, where they would take the tobacco out of the trailers and loop it, and be putting it in the tobacco barns. That was a significant period for me, because being 9 and taking a tractor on the field, which was something that was probably not well, I'd say it was probably common for the time, because there was a lot of young boys that were doing probably the same thing that I was doing. But that made a significant impact on me. So what I'm hoping to do is make a series of videos looking back on life events, and to see how those life events and the decisions were made, that and the choices that were made actually made me the person that I am today. But looking back on it, trying to reflect on those times and those decisions and those choices that were made, you know, what kind of impact that actually had on me that I didn't know at the time. But looking back on it now, I can see how they were just significant points in my life that were pretty significant. And we don't always realize the choices at the time that were made, what kind of influence that would have on you. And I can only really look back and tell you what kind of influence it had on me from a reflective standpoint. So I grew up on a family farm in eastern North Carolina. I was born in 1956, and my dad passed away in 1958 when I was just 22 months old, so I have no memories of him whatsoever. But the memory that I do have is from my mother at the time. I do recall later on she told me that in 1957, with him, with my dad working off farm at DuPont, he would work the second shift, like 3 to 11, and he would be farming in the mornings. And she told me that in 1957 that they had made $10,000 that year. And in 1957, that was a significant amount of money. So she was thinking that at that time they were really going to be up and coming. And probably today, if he had lived, I would imagine that we would probably be one of the larger farmers here in the area. But in 1958, he passed away, and it wasn't suddenly. He had cancer, and back in those days they didn't have much cures for those cancers, and I don't know if they'd had any cure for him at the time with what he had. But the one thing that I do know is that in 1957, she went from thinking that they were really going to be up and coming to 1958 being to the point that she was alone and had 3 kids under the age of 12 and was living off of Social Security and a little bit of farm income. But along about that time, and we had known him all along, Mr. Roman Witherington, who was a good friend of my dad's, came in and he rented the farm, and he actually helped us quite a bit around the house, especially from the garden standpoint. He'd come in and make up the rows and get it fertilized for us. keep our tools sharpened so that Mother could grow a pretty large garden and put up food for us all winter. So we did that, and that was something that I was pretty heavily involved in, but I just didn't know exactly at the time, what that was doing for me from the standpoint of establishing the character that I would carry on. Because they say by the time you're 9 or 10 years old that your character is pretty much set from what you had already been doing for those first few years. So even by the time I was 9, I can remember going to the bank, and I distinctly remember taking $36 in the bank, and my mother wanted me to establish a savings account. I can remember taking that $36 and putting up on the counter. I had to reach up, put the money on the counter, and the teller would take the money. She got a passbook, and she would just write out in ink on the passport, on the passbook, I had $36 in there, and that would be for my record. And that was the beginning of my savings. I can remember starting my first day in 3rd grade at Griffin Elementary School. The first day of school, the teacher would go around and, get you to stand up and say something about who you were, what your name was, and who your parents were. And I can remember that there were 4 people in front of me that got up, and they would talk about who their mother and daddy were and the things that they did that summer as far as vacations and what they did that summer. It got to me, and I realized at that moment that I didn't have a dad around, and that also that I was working, whereas everybody else seemed to be taking little vacations and going off and having fun. And looking back on that, it's not that I wasn't having any fun or doing anything, but it was just a little bit of a different lifestyle that I had, which I think was probably good. So at that time, I didn't realize that the choices that were being made for me and that I was making, and those choices I was making and not even knowing I was making the choices, what an impact that would have on me. And those hardships, even though I didn't necessarily recognize that they were hardships at the time, what kind of impact that would have on me. And I think it had a great impact on me for sure, and impacts that I'm glad that I had. One of the big thing, if not the biggest thing that impacted my life at the time, was this church right here. Because back in those days, we had the rural life, we had the farming community, and we had our church. And our social life really revolved around what we did at church. And the people that were involved in my life at that time, I can remember them like Mr. Roman Worthington, who I mentioned already, Kurt and Emma Witherington, who were also, and Miss Gay, who was Mr. Roman's wife. What a significant part that they played in my life, and how I looked up to them. So what I'd like for you to do, I'd like for you to start recognizing things, if that's something that you want to reflect on, the decisions that maybe that were made on your behalf and for you and by you back in your younger days, and how those decisions really turned out to be impactful on who you ended up coming to be. And if you want to, drop a comment and tell me some of those names and maybe a little bit about how they impacted you, and just tell me, how they were so significant in your life. So what I thought we were going to do is, like the few names that I've mentioned, and maybe the names you come up with, this will be a time that we can actually honor those people. And I would imagine that a lot of them have already passed on and are gone, but it'll just give you a minute to reflect on them again and what kind of impact they had on you. So you can follow my journey with this video series and the choices that were made by us and how they made us who we are. And I think you'll look back on it and see it be a time of reflection, and how it'll be good just to sit down and take a moment and just think about who you are and how you got to where you came to be. So I think this will be a good reflective period for us. So it's just a time to remember that at those ages, what we were absorbing, not necessarily know that we were making any decisions, but things that were happening around us that was causing us to be who we are, and just the types of things that we were absorbing, from the mentors that we had around us, and how that impacted on our life. So in closing, what I like to say, at those young ages, it's not about the decisions that were made or decisions that we made and didn't even know it, but it was really about impressions.